Hi all, Mishaps here with a recap on your research this week into why our girl Elizabeth I remained a single lady. So let's begin. Firstly, when considering why Elizabeth remained unwed, we cannot underestimate just how remarkable Elizabeth's decision was. Before the Reformation, women had only really been allowed to remain single if they had entered holy orders. Women were expected to marry, to be handed over from father to husband in a patriarchal society which saw women as needing to be controlled and guided by men throughout their lives. This, of course, as a queen, had major implications for Elizabeth's power. When we discuss the theme of marriage in an essay, we might focus on the argument that Elizabeth remained unwed for the reason of maintaining her power. We might therefore use the evidence of her early speeches or her response to Parliament in 1563, which we've already looked at. We might also use the words of the Scottish ambassador Sir James Melville, who in 1564 teased the Queen that she remained unwed as she would like to be both king and queen. Certainly, Elizabeth's virginal status was utilised to build her brand, particularly in her later years, making her the wife or mother of the nation and like a secular Virgin Mary. When we look at her paintings, she drips in pearls and bows which highlight her virginity and her chastity. In the famous rainbow portrait, which you can see here, too, she wears her hair down, highlighting her marital status. Perhaps linking to the power argument are the examples of the implications of marriage amongst Elizabeth's female relatives. This is the argument that Retha Warnick put forward. There was not a single queen whose reign had not been complicated by marriage. Our Lord President of the Council, John Dudley, had manoeuvred his son Guildford into marriage with Lady Jane Grey, which would have transformed the Tudor dynasty into the Dudley dynasty, and he hoped allow himself to control her. Elizabeth herself had been directly affected by the fallout of Wyatt's rebellion in the reign of Mary, and finally she herself was a vocal critic of her cousin Mary's decisions to get married. Mary's marriage to Darnley, his subsequent murder, and Mary's abduction and marriage to James Hepburn, the Earl of Bothwell, led to her disgrace, and her literally being captured, denounced and paraded as a whore through the streets of Edinburgh before being forced to flee to England. When we look at the relationships and the marriages of her female relatives, staying unwed as a way to protect her power suddenly becomes quite sensible. Linking to power, we come to the argument that it was a lack of viable suitor that was the reason that Elizabeth remained unwed. Certainly, in choosing a husband, Elizabeth faced opposition or stoking of faction amongst her councillors or her parliamentarians. We can see evidence of this in the conflicts between Cecil and Dudley in the 1560s. Cecil backed Spanish Habsburg matches, whilst Dudley proposed French Valois suits. Furthermore, matches with the most powerful bachelors in Europe would also see the issue of religion, and in particular Catholicism, brought to the fore. Now, I won't go into this too much detail, as you've already created fact files on these different men. However, let's have a look at the idea of faction, alliances and power. We may argue that Elizabeth actually was never going to choose a match. We could, though, say that her nearly going through with Alençon in the 1570s and early 1580s showed that she was willing to make a choice. However, again, it's important to note here that securing an alliance with Alençon, and therefore with the French Valois dynasty, was a very politically astute decision in a time when tensions with Habsburg Spain were rising. Coming penultimately on to Dudley then. A childhood friend, they'd met age 7, charming, brash, supposedly handsome and the same age as Elizabeth. Rumours would dog her for most of her reign that she was either holding herself out for him or she was already engaging in an affair with him. Progresses were said to be an excuse for her to give birth to her bastard children. Some historians, and certainly TV, film and historical fiction writers, love to put this love that could never be tragic romance argument forward when it comes to the reasons why Elizabeth remained unmarried. Certainly, we can find lots of evidence of closeness between Dudley and Elizabeth. On her ascension, she made him master of the horse, and rumours abounded of their love. It was said in the early years of her reign that Elizabeth was constantly in and out of his chambers. She called him her eyes, and when he died, she took to her chambers for a week and kept his last letter in a casket by her bed for the rest of her days. Yet this underestimates Elizabeth's intelligence, I think. She sent him away from the court following the death of his wife Amy in September 1560. In 1564, she proposed him as a match for Mary Queen of Scots. Her counsellors railed against him. In 1566, Cecil said of the man that other courtiers spitefully called the gypsy, "Nothing would be increased by marriage with him either in riches, estimation or power. He shall study nothing but to enhance his own particular friends, to wealth, offices, and lands to offend others. He is infamed by the death of his wife, he is far in debt, and he is like to prove jealous of the Queen's majesty." Cecil was so horrified by a possible match with Dudley that he even threatened to quit if she was to go near him. Yet Dudley didn't give up. In 1575, he put on nearly 20 days of entertainments at his castle of Kenilworth near Warwick. He hosted a firework display, cannon firing that could be heard from 20 miles away, banquets and pageants, which begged Elizabeth to follow the path of true love in marrying him. He even had these portraits and drawings, which are put on this slide, created for the occasion. Both he and Elizabeth are shown in matching doublets, surrounded by spaniel dogs symbolising chastity and love, and both facing the same way, leaning next to the same chairs. These were all the signifiers of a married couple. He was therefore pretty confident of his success. Whether Liz was annoyed at all this though, or just at the hypocrisy of a man pronouncing himself her true love publicly, with not one but two mistresses, she decided to bounce off early. She left Kenilworth before he could ask for her hand. The proposal failed. I think we can say there was a love there. However, I think Elizabeth was far too clever to ever truly entertain it and consider marrying him. Or maybe I'm just falling into the trap of making her too much of a feminist icon in my own mind. Another argument put forward, though less popular amongst historians, is the argument that Elizabeth remained unwed due to an aversion to intimacy or the idea of marriage. Now, most historians would argue that this slips into psychoanalysis. Without diaries or secret letters, we can't really put Elizabeth on the therapist's sofa. We can't really get into her mind. However, it is certainly true that her early life was marred by violence and death linked to marriage. Her own mother was accused of treason famously in 1536 following some courtly flirtation and the miscarriage of a son early in that year. Elizabeth then was only 3 years old. Though she would have little memory of it, it did lead to a decline in her status, and she went from being the Princess Elizabeth to the Lady Elizabeth for the rest of her childhood. Furthermore, she lost 2 more stepmothers to death in childbirth, and her 5th, like her mother, also lost her head. Now again, the impacts of this would have to include a bit of conjecture. Elizabeth, for example, never talked of her mother, and inversely was always very, very proud of her father. She regularly referred to herself in terms of almost being the strong son he never had, and she called herself regularly the lion's cub. We can though say that the Seymour affair did have a real impact on Elizabeth. His inappropriate actions towards her led to Catherine Parr sending her away from the household they shared in 1548. After Parr's death in childbirth, Elizabeth was forced to go through interrogations into her own virginity to prove that she wasn't pregnant with Seymour's child despite the fact that she'd been 14 at the time, and she was questioned as to whether she'd actually plotted to marry Seymour as a way of seizing power alongside him. It all had a very large impact on a girl who was less than 16 years old, and from that point onwards until she became queen, she dressed extremely conservatively, always covering herself up and wearing darker colours. So there you have it, a very, very quick recap of marriage from what you've been reading whilst we've been away. Watch the second video I'm about to put up to help you plan and write the essay that I want you to write for Friday, and in the meantime, stay safe and keep it Tudor.